Okay, so welcome back. This is going to be screencast number 2 for chapter 26, and what we're going to try to do with this screencast is we are going to try to finish up this chapter. What we're going to do today is we are going to make our way through the various orders that you would find in this particular group of reptiles. And the first order that we're going to look at is an order by the name of Testudines. And the Testudines are the ones that actually include the turtles and the tortoises. Now, just like the turtle that you're looking at in lab, the shell is going to consist of what we consider a dorsal carapace, and so the carapace is going to be this area right through here, and it's going to consist also of a ventral plastron, and so the plastron is going to be that part of the shell that was already removed when you started working on your turtles. Now, the outer layer of this particular shell is going to be made of keratin and an inner layer of bone. And so right on the outside, right underneath the outside layer which has the scute, you're going to find that layer of keratin, and that's probably going to make up a good majority of those scutes. And then you're going to find the bone, which is going to be right here. Now that bone is going to be a fusion of the ribs, the vertebrae, and dermally ossified elements, which means basically any other parts of the animal that are made of bone. Now these animals do lack teeth. Remember we had talked about them of having sort of like a kind of almost a bird-like beak for their mouth. So they're going to use this sort of bird-like beak to basically use it for gripping food. So they really don't have teeth to chew things up. So when they do feed, they kind of just simply rip things apart and swallow whatever food they happen to be dining on. Now, turtles and tortoises are really kind of unique in regards to how they respire, because you're talking about an animal that has a very rigid outer covering. Now, in most cases, for most animals, that thoracic cavity needs to be able to expand and retract, but in this case, the turtle can't do that because of that shell. So to solve this problem, they're going to use both their abdominal and their pectoral muscles as a diaphragm. Now, if you remember, we had talked about that rib ventilation breathing that we had looked at way back in the day when we first started our discussion of reptiles. And that diaphragm was a really important piece of how animals typically will breathe. But in this case, they're not going to be able to use the standard diaphragm that we would find in most animals, and they're going to have to use these two sets of muscles to allow them to bring in air and to push that air out. So the air is going to be drawn in by a contraction of the limb flank muscles. And this is going to allow the abdominal cavity to actually increase in volume. So once this increase in volume does occur, that's going to allow the animal to bring in air. But of course, once you bring in air, then you need to be able to exhale or push that air back out. And so in this case, that's going to happen by actually drawing back the shoulder girdle in this case, and it's going to compress all the viscera that are found inside of that animal's body and essentially push that air out of the animal. Now, movement of the limbs while walking will also help to ventilate the lungs as well. And if you remember back at the beginning of our discussion on reptiles, we had talked about some groups of animals, in this case the turtles, that can actually gain sufficient oxygen by simply pumping water in and out of the mouth. And so these aquatic turtles actually have what we would consider somewhat of a cutaneous type of respiration, which means respiration through the skins. It doesn't mean that they have gills, but they can actually passively take in oxygen and push CO2 out through those very thin membranes that you would find in their mouth. Now, when discussing the nervous system of turtles and tortoises, you're going to find that the brain itself is actually pretty small. It's about less than 1% of the total body weight of that animal. But in this case, the cerebrum is actually going to be a little bit larger than what you would find in amphibians. And what that indicates to us is that they actually do have the capacity to learn some very simple tasks. They do have a middle and an inner ear, but sound perception is super poor when it comes down to this group. They can occasionally make sounds, especially when they're eating or maybe when the males are actually getting ready to breed or mate with the females. Now, they do have a pretty good sense of smell, they have a pretty acute sense of vision, and their color perception is about equal to humans. Now, turtles and tortoises are considered oviparous, which means they are egg layers and fertilization is internal. Most groups will bury their eggs in the ground, and simply what will happen is when the female is ready to lay her eggs, she's going to build a pretty simple nest, typically with her hind feet, and she's going to go ahead and lay her eggs, and she'll cover these eggs up, and then after that she pretty much deserts these eggs. Now, in some turtle families, the nest temperature will actually determine the sex of hatchlings. And in fact, this doesn't only occur with turtles, but it can actually occur with other reptiles as well. If you have a nest where the eggs are being exposed to relatively low temperatures, then you might actually get a higher number of males being produced. But if you have a nest that for whatever reason the temperature tends to be a little bit higher, then this nest most likely will produce females. And so the gender of these offspring is temperature determined in this group of animals. Now, marine turtles are going to be buoyed by the water, which means that it's going to be basically an element that they can use that allows them to float throughout their environment. And this is pretty important because some of these marine turtles can get pretty large. In fact, some marine turtles can reach up to 2 meters in length and weigh up to 725 kilograms in weight. Remember, there's 2.2 pounds for every kilogram, so you're looking at about 1,500 pounds in weight. Now, giant land tortoises, on the other hand, such as those on the Galapagos Islands, can actually weigh several hundred kilograms. So again, they can weigh almost as much as some of the sea turtles you would find in the ocean. Now, a lot of these larger turtles and tortoises, even some of the small ones, do tend to have low metabolic activity, and a lot of scientists believe that this is actually what will contribute to their longevity. And there are some tortoises, especially the ones you find in the Galapagos Islands, that are believed to have exceeded 150 years in age. Now, box turtles, on the other hand, the ones you see over here on the right-hand side, they're kind of a unique group of turtles because this group of animals is going to have a shell that's actually going to allow almost the entire body to be totally retracted into the shell. And the reason for this is because the shell that you would find on the ventral part of the animal, the plastron, is actually hinged. So as it pulls the body into the shell, that plastron piece, the piece that you would find right down through here, is going to be able to snap up and actually close off the most anterior part of that shell. So on the opposite extreme, we have a group of animals here, the snapping turtles, that really have lost the ability to even partially withdraw their body into the shell. And so because of this, they've had to adapt or develop other ways to defend themselves. And as most of us know, snapping turtles are famous for their very extreme aggression and their ability to clamp on and basically defend themselves using these jaws. And so their jaws are extremely strong. Now, because of that, most of these animals are considered carnivorous, which means they're going to feed on fish, frogs, waterfowl, and pretty much anything else they can get their mouth on. Now, the second order we're going to look at is the order Squamata, and this includes the lizards and the snakes, and in this case, the suborder Sauria is going to include the lizards. And so all the information that we're going to look at here is going to deal with this particular suborder. Now, this is a pretty diverse group with both terrestrial, burrowing, aquatic, arboreal, which means those animals that actually live in the trees, and even some aerial members as well, which means they could actually pass maybe from tree to tree by, I wouldn't say flying, but they have developed some maneuvers that allow them to, let's just say, take flight for a brief period of time. Geckos is going to be one group of this suborder that, well, you've seen the geckos in my classroom. I have a tokay and a couple of leopard geckos that are relatively small lizards. They're pretty agile, which means they can move around quite easily, and a lot of these geckos do tend to be nocturnal, and you're going to see that in my class because you don't often see these geckos out during the daylight. Now, most geckos, except for the leopard geckos that I have in my classroom, do have adhesive toe pads, which allows them to walk on ceilings, walls, etc. Now, another group is the iguanids, and this would be something very similar to the green iguana, maybe the marine iguana that you see over here on the right-hand side. And this includes many of the New World lizards as well as the marine iguanas that you might find on the Galapagos. And then the third group are the chameleons. Now these are what we would consider arboreal lizards of Africa and Madagascar. So these would be the ones that you would often see in trees. And most of the members of this particular group are going to have an extendable tongue, very similar to what you would have seen in the amphibians. And you can see this chameleon over here on the right-hand side extending its tongue in order to capture its prey. Now, some lizards do have what we consider degenerate limbs, which means that they're pretty much limbless. And the glass lizards, like you would see over here on the right, actually fall into this category. Kind of similar to the Sicilians we had looked at with the amphibians. Now, if you're looking at a lizard, you're going to look at an animal that actually has a movable eyelid. Now, when you compare this to the snakes, snakes do not have eyelids, which means they pretty much look as though they have their eyes open all the time. But snakes do have a very important transparent covering, which is there to protect their eyes. Now, lizards do have an external ear, and this is going to be another difference between the snakes and the lizards. Snakes are going to lack this external ear. Geckos are a group of lizards that actually do use vocal signals to announce territory and possibly to drive away males. In fact, the tokay gecko that we have in my classroom, if you tend to irritate it a bit, it will sort of bark at you, which kind of demonstrates those vocal abilities of this group. Now, because of their various adaptations, some lizards survive extremely well in very hot and very dry regions of this planet. Now, one way these animals are able to survive in these hot and arid regions is that they actually conserve water, and they do this by producing a semi-solid urine. And remember, we had talked about the general characteristics of reptiles, and one of them is that they actually produce a urine that is somewhat semi-solid, and it has a very high content of crystalline uric acid. Now, there are some lizards that can actually store fat in their tails, and this is going to be used to provide energy and possibly metabolic water during droughts. And the leopard geckos we have in the back of my room, like the one you see down here, is a good example of this type of lizards. Now, there are a couple of venomous lizards that we do have out there, and the Gila monster would be one, and the beaded lizard would be the second one. And these are really the only lizards that are capable of inflicting a venomous bite. Now, lizards do keep their body temperature relatively constant because they are considered ectotherms, and they do this by behavioral thermal regulation. And what that simply means is that when it gets warm, these animals will come out and they will basically sun themselves to help raise their body temperature, and if it gets too hot, they will actually retreat into the shade to help cool down their body temperature, because again, they are ectotherms, so their body temperature is entirely dependent on their environment. Now, the suborder Serpentes, which is going to include the snakes, are considered the group of reptiles that are limbless, and so most of these animals have lost their pectoral and pelvic girdles of their skeleton. Now, the many vertebrae that are found in these animals, which are much more than you would find in the lizards or any other type of reptile or any other type of animal for that matter, are much wider in comparison to other tetrapods, and this is going to allow sort of the undulation or the undulating nature that you would find in their movement. Now, because of the way their body is actually put together, they've actually had to adapt in terms of how they feed, so they actually have feeding apparatus which is going to allow them to eat prey that tend to be several times their own diameter in size. Now, a lot of times we think about a snake as being able to unhinge its jaw. Well, it's not exactly the case. They have jaws that are basically loosely joined together, which means they can't simply unhinge the jaw, but it's more of a flexible jaw. In other words, there's some space that you're going to find between the upper and the lower jaw. So because of this additional space, it's going to allow that jaw to spread apart. Now, the skull bones are also very loosely articulated. And when we say articulated, we're talking about how those bones would be put together. And so again, that additional space. And so this is again going to be an additional adaptation that's going to allow that mouth to accommodate that larger prey. Now, to allow breathing during the very slow process of swallowing their prey, they have a special adaptation, which is a tracheal opening that has been extended, which means that it kind of is pushed out kind of towards this area. You're going to find the trachea is going to extend a little bit more forward in the mouth of these animals. And so once the prey item has actually pushed its way past a certain point, it's going to allow that animal to breathe as it continues to move that prey item down through its body. As we had said, when you compare these animals to lizards, their eyeballs actually have reduced mobility. And remember, we had talked about that permanent corneal membrane that's going to be there for protection. So these animals really don't have eyelids. They can't close their eyes. Now, most snakes do have very poor vision. They do lack the external ears. Remember, that was a big difference between this group and the lizards. And so they do not respond to most aerial sounds. But they can feel vibrations at very low frequencies, especially vibrations that are carried in the ground. Now, chemical senses rather than vision or hearing are typically the main senses that are going to be used to hunt prey. And so because these animals have such a heavy reliance on the chemical nature of their environment, they've actually adapted and developed a special organ called the Jacobson's organ. And you can see the Jacobson's organ right here. And in order to access this organ, they're going to have a pair of pits in the roof of the mouth. And these pits are going to be lined with olfactory epithelium. Remember, olfactory basically indicates we're talking about a sense of smell. Now, the forked tongue is often going to be used to sort of pick up these scent particles in the environment, and move them over to these pits so they can be picked up by this epithelium. Now, when you look at the skin of most snakes, you're going to notice that it's actually going to be infolded between the scales that you would find in this reptile. And the reason for that is because as they take in that very large meal, they need to be able to stretch or expand the skin itself, or expand the body, and the skin is essentially going to be unfolded during the feeding process. Now, pit vipers such as rattlesnakes actually have special pits with nerve endings that are going to be very sensitive to the heat that's going to be emitted by warm-blooded birds and mammals, and they're going to use these animals as their prey. The viper fangs are going to be very hollow, and they're going to be hinged so they can actually inject venom when the snake strikes. And on average, there's going to be about 8,000 snake bites each year in the U.S., with about only 12 actually resulting in death. Now, if you're a non-venomous snake, of course, you're not going to be able to take advantage of this. You're going to have to kill your prey in another way. And like the snakes that I have in my classroom, most likely you're going to take advantage of the ability to constrict, or basically suffocate your prey. And they're going to do this by biting and then simply wrapping around that prey. Once the prey is dead, then they're going to go ahead and swallow that prey item. Now, reproduction in snakes, most are going to be oviparous, which means they're going to be egg layers. Others, including some of the pit vipers, are going to be ovoviviparous, which means that they're going to retain the eggs in the animal's body. They're going to hatch, and as we had said, it kind of looks like they're giving birth to live young, but it's not exactly the same as viviparous. Few snakes are viviparous, in other words, having a very primitive placenta to exchange the nutrients with their young, but there are a few that are out there. Female snakes can even store sperm for many months, if not many years, and so they can actually lay several clutches of fertile eggs long after a single mating. Now, the next order is the order Sphenodonta, and this is the Tuatara. There's actually only 2 living species that are going to be found on this planet, and they're going to be in New Zealand, and these represent the ancient lineage of reptiles. Now, they were once really widespread across New Zealand, but the 2 species now are very restricted to small islands in this area. Now, loss of the Tuatara has largely been attributed to the human introduction of non-native species which have tended to prey on the Tuatara. Tuataras tend to be much more vulnerable than other reptiles because they have an extremely slow growth and reproductive rate. Now, they're lizard-like, and they do live in burrows that are often shared with petrels, which is a type of bird. They are very slow-growing and very slow to mature, and they can live up to 77 years of age. But they do have what we consider a very well-developed median parietal eye. So that's going to be the eye that you would find right in the middle of the forehead, kind of similar to the lampreys when we looked at those back when we talked about the fish. And this is going to be buried beneath the skin. And we're not quite sure what it's being used for, but again, light sensitivity might be something to consider when you talk about a structure such as this. So the very last order we're going to look at is the order Crocodilian, and this includes the crocodiles and the alligators. Alligators and caimans are found primarily in the New World and do tend to have a much broader snout when compared to the crocodiles and the gavial. Crocodiles are very widely distributed over the planet, and the gavial, which is this one right down here towards the bottom, this is going to occur primarily in India and Burma, and it's really easy to spot these because, as we had said, their snout is even more apparent when it comes down to the narrowing of that snout. Now, all of these animals in this group are going to have a very well-reinforced skull and jaw, and it's going to be very heavily muscled. And this is important because if you think about these animals, they do tend to have a very powerful bite. When they do feed, what they do tend to do is they do tend to grasp onto their prey and simply move their head back and forth, and that's pretty much how they tear it apart. Now, the teeth in these animals are going to be set in sockets, kind of similar to our teeth. They're going to have a 4-chambered heart, and this is a little bit different from the other reptiles we had looked at, which had a 3-chambered heart. And alligators and crocodiles are considered oviparous. They usually have between 20 and 50 eggs, and they're laid in a mass of vegetation. And you can see the nest of this alligator right down here. So this group is also pretty unique because it's one of the rare reptile individuals that will actually guard its nest and even take care of the young for a brief period of time afterwards. Like we had talked about with the turtles, though, nest temperature is going to play a big part in what gender of offspring are going to be produced. So if you have high nest temperatures, it does tend to produce more males. If you have low nest temperatures, it's going to tend to produce females. And this could result in females outnumbering males by up to 5 to 1. Alright, so that's going to finish up our second screencast for Chapter 26, and as I had said, this is going to be our final screencast. And again, this was a long one, but again, we are moving extremely fast, so it's really important that you make sure that you get this screencast study guide done before you come to class.